This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and we are happy to have you on our webinar today. The webinar is about grant writing, how to get started, and we will be sending out a copy of the slides for you after the webinar concludes, along with an outline of my presentation notes and also hopefully a link to this webinar. We are attempting to record it, so hopefully the recording itself will work, but if not, at least you'll have a copy of the slides and my presentation notes. And I do apologize that I had forgotten to unmute at the very beginning at 10 o'clock, but we're only, I think, a couple minutes short of that 10 o'clock, so hopefully I still have everybody on here. What I want to talk to you about today is the actual process of writing a grant application. And if you've never done it before, how you can position yourself to get started to do that. So we will not be discussing funding sources. That's a whole nother conversation. And what I will do, though, is when the webinar completes, is I'll make sure you get a link to the funding guide that ODOT has available on its website that you can take a look at. I'm going to go ahead and get us started with the actual content of the webinar now. And as any good transportation agency, we love our roadmaps, and I'm going to give you a roadmap for today's presentation, and then we'll move into the specific pieces. So the first topic we're going to discuss is determining the need that you have, that you'd like to have grants cover or fund for you. And it's really important to have the need predetermined, because without that, you're not going to know what type of grant that you want to go after to apply to hopefully receive funding. Another thing that we're going to discuss is how to get yourself ahead of the curve, really, in gathering information and getting it ready, so when you do have a grant opportunity that comes along, you can then focus on what the grant is asking of you, as opposed to trying to gather all the basic information that's going to have to go into practically any grant application. We're going to discuss about looking for grants which address your needs. When you start grant writing, you're going to be tempted to want to apply for everything that's out there, and it's not a good thing to apply for everything. You don't want to just get your name in the mix to have it in the mix. You want to be selective and make sure that you only apply for grants which really, are applicable to what the needs are that you are trying to meet. We're going to discuss reviewing your grant requirements in detail, and hopefully a process that you can use to keep yourself on track once you've reviewed those grant requirements, to then plan your grant completion strategy. I know a lot of folks who wait until the absolute last minute to do their grant applications, and it shows when you do that, and it also will reflect back in not being selected a lot of times. So you want to have a strategy. You want to make sure you keep yourself moving ahead of the curve. We also want to discuss what it is you want to request as a part of your grant. And we want to make sure that as you are putting your grant together, that you answer the questions that are being asked. And this is probably the toughest part when you first start writing a grant. I know it was for me. In my first grant application, I had so much great information about the organization I was trying to assist that I did not focus on answering the questions that were asked. I wanted to turn them into the questions that I wanted them to ask, so then I could tell them what I felt they needed to know. So we'll talk about that. And then relationship building, which is also a huge part of the grant application process. I myself have written grants for over 20 years now, and not just professionally through my job working with ODOT and the LTAP Center, but I've also worked within my community as a volunteer to write grants for different nonprofit organizations to help bring different services and improve the quality of life in the community where I live. So I'm going to speak to you on all these points, not just from my perspective in writing grants for LTAP, but also my perspective in working with those nonprofits. So let's just jump right in. I want to do a mentee question, so I'm going to go ahead and switch my screen over to the mentee meter, and hopefully some of you have chosen to be a part of that discussion. And I see that we have at least 21 people who've responded already. So if you haven't yet, if you'd like to participate in the Mentimeter polling, please feel free to do so. The link for Mentee is mentee.com, MENTI.com. And then the code you would put in is the top of the screen that's showing right now, but I'll read it off to you as well. It's 87 27 85 50. So we'd love to know who we have on the webinar and let everyone else know who's on the webinar as well. So looks like we've got quite a few respondents. I don't want to cut anybody off because we know we have about 100 people on the webinar right now. So I'm going to still leave that question up for a little bit before I go to the next one. But I don't want to also, take too much time on any one question. So I'm going to switch back over to the presentation, but please feel free to keep answering until we move to the next question, then you can answer that one. So we're going to talk about determining your need. And this is very important because this is the whole reason why you're writing a grant application. And you need to have a clear plan for what you're going to spend funds on. You're asking somebody to give you or your organization. So make sure you know what it is that the organization wants to spend funds on. In my case, I've helped to write grant applications not only for safety training for our civil engineers here in Ohio, but I've written grant applications as a volunteer for our local fire department. I've written grant applications to help keep our community pool open. Also written grant applications to help build a local park and then to help and put in a playground at our local park. And you need to know exactly what it is that they want to fund. And it's not premature, even before a grant becomes available, to get quotes for whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. So, go out and get quotes for equipment, get a project estimate put together. I mean, if it's more than just purchasing equipment, if it's, like in our case, with the one organization I worked with, building a whole new ballpark for the kids because the school district was taking the land where our old ballpark was, then you need to get a whole project estimate put together. And that took us some time. We had to get all of our details. There was the land acquisition, there was the dirt work that had to be done, there was fencing, there were special regulation sizes for the different ball fields. Definitely, I was not a subject matter expert in that area at all, but I had a lot of great people that were working with me on that team. So we worked to get those details hammered out ahead of time. And make sure as you're putting those details together that you show objectivity in what you're doing, especially I know with the state of Ohio, we have to be objective by law with our purchasing requirements. But a lot of times when you get into helping different organizations, even within your own community, somebody seems to always know somebody who could do that work. And while it's great to have connections and relationships, it's also very important to show that you're being objective in how the funds are going to be used. So don't just get one estimate, get 3 when you're putting your details together. So that way that you've, hopefully gotten a good estimate amount, and that you're also showing objectivity to anybody who you'd be asking to provide you funds. And you also need to have together a clear plan for delivering the project and know how you're going to measure success. That's very important. I know when I started writing the grant for the safety training for our civil engineers in Ohio, I wanted to measure success on the number of the reduction in fatalities on the roadways. And one of the things, and that is our ultimate goal in providing that training, is that our civil engineers will learn new techniques and new technical information that they can apply as they are improving the safety on the roadways. But really, the measurement of success for my asking for funds to provide training was that we provided the training. And I think it was important for me not to over expand our ultimate goal and try to take responsibility through this grant application for something that we really technically couldn't, say that we had achieved solely because we received that grant. Now, we could say we achieved offering training and having people take the training because of the grant funds. So it's important to know how you're going to measure success. And also, you need to know upfront, and this is part of determining your needs, if there's going to be ongoing costs, how are those going to be covered without further grant funding? Like with the park that we worked on building in our community, we were able to determine that the township was going to take that over once the park was built, and that they would continue the maintenance and upkeep and be able to have them give a letter stating that they are willing to do that. So those are questions that your grant agency are going to want to ask and have answers to before they ever give you the first penny of funding. So we're going to go to mentee question number 2. I've got quite a few here in the very beginning, and then we'll we'll also move through with some others later. So I'm going to navigate us to the next question. What type of needs do you plan to seek grant funding to accomplish? And this is more of an open-ended response question. So if you could put your response in, and it'll actually start scrolling up on the screen for everybody to be able to see, that would be great. And I'm just curious, with those of you who are attending the webinar, all related to ADA and accessibility. That's great. Yes, absolutely. And I'll tell you, with the type of grants I'm seeing out there now, you need to make sure that on your reporting requirements that if they're asking for specific information to be reported in the long term, especially for ADA and accessibility, that you want to make certain you can actually track that information. I recently wrote a grant application that I'm still waiting to hear back on, that they want to know that we have reached specific groups of individuals through the funding that they've provided us. And it's something that, while we've tracked it in the past and we have the capability to track it, it was important to know that they were going to want that tracked for this grant reporting, because had we not known it ahead of time, we wouldn't have known to collect that information. So, a lot of you are looking at equipment, replacing sidewalks, building new paths, transportation projects, park improvements. Absolutely. I mean, there's just so much out there, that the work that needs to be done, and writing grants to secure funding. So great. It's wonderful to see all of these comments that are coming in. Thank you for sharing that. And some folks who didn't link into the mentee, so that their mentee isn't refreshing, they're putting information in about road improvements. So great. All right, I'm going to switch us back over to the presentation here, and we'll keep rolling through. But feel free to continue to add comments in there. I'll leave that question up until we go on to the next one. So determining your need, and I believe we talked a little bit about this, but I want to make sure that you really have it down, that you need to describe the problem that's going to be fixed with the grant funding. And you need to explain not only why is it a need, but why it is that you need their funding in order to fix this problem. Explaining that there isn't funds available anywhere else in the budget, or any other current sources that you have available that would be able to pay for those expenses. And you need to have a clear plan on what you would spend the grant funds on. This is what we talked about as far as making sure you have your quotes ready, have all the information mapped out. No one really wants to provide money to somebody who has an idea but doesn't really have a clear path to get there. So that brings me to my next mentee question, which I'm going to go ahead and get loaded here on the screen. And those of you who are in the mentee, hopefully that's pulled up for you already. But tell me, what's your, be honest here, what's your level of planning? You know, what's your traditional level of planning? So I can tell you that I probably in my life live in all 5 of these levels. It just depends where and what I'm doing. So I'm not so much that high live in the moment type planning, because even when I'm going on vacation, I tend to plan things well in advance. But on occasion, I can maybe for a Saturday afternoon do that living in the moment part. It looks like the majority of you are list people. You have lists, they're your friends and you use them regularly. Some of you, make lists and follow them sometimes, and there's a few of you that map things out generally, have high level steps in mind. And then there's a contingency that they plan everything step by step and follow the details whenever possible. And I've got to tell you that, if you are one of those, I live in the moment people, and you just didn't, ante up to that here on this response, it's okay, because you can either choose to, use the planning process and, do the plan that needs done, or you can find somebody on your team, hopefully, to help you with that. But I'm glad to say the majority of you are saying that you are planners and, are in that, at least the list portion. And those of you who are down here in the do everything step by step, follow the details whenever possible, grant writing hopefully is going to come very easy to you. Also those who use lists regularly. And for those who, have kind of dabbled in the list area, you'll just have to put a little more focus into making sure that you do the advanced planning in a more thorough manner and have that out there. Because planning is really what this is all about, is making sure that you have the information that you need when you need it and can get it submitted. So I'm going to move us back over to the presentation. So the next thing we're going to talk about with the need, and then we'll move on, is making sure you have a clear plan for delivering the project, knowing how you're going to measure success, and then that coverage of any additional costs when the grant funding has been expended. So it's best if you can build a team to make sure you have one of those folks that are planners on there and people who love to use lists and love to map things out. And for those of you who love to do that, you can start on this next step even when we get done with the webinar today, if you haven't done so already. Gather general information about your agency or organization. What is it that you do? Why are you important to your customers? You want to make sure that you have, not only specific information about the agency, and this is not a table of organization for Adams County in Ohio. I found it from another state. But have, that type of basic information. If you're a nonprofit, you need to make sure that you have a copy of your letter from the IRS stating what type of nonprofit you are. If you don't have it, you can write them a letter and ask them for that copy, because the people who are making the grants are going to require that for a nonprofit. I haven't seen a grant yet that a nonprofit could apply without providing details about their nonprofit status from the IRS. So you want to make sure you have that information in there. You also want to make sure that you have information about your tax ID number, because they're going to need that for their IRS reporting. So, figure out where you stand as far as, your organization. And a good example is, our LTAP center actually, since we are within ODOT, we're a part of the Ohio Department of Transportation, which is a part of the state of Ohio. When I first started writing for grant applications for LTAP, I had no clue that I was going to have to put the state of Ohio's tax identification number in. But through some research, I figured that out. And it was important for me to have that information ahead of time, as opposed to waiting till, I was in the throes of trying to write why we needed the grant, to then also be figuring all these other pieces and parts out. If there's space in the grant application, put in information too about projects that your organization has completed that are same or similar possibly to what you're asking for funds to complete now. So if you have had successful projects in the past for bike paths or walking paths or transportation projects, this is an image from a project that was funded in South Dakota for a bridge improvement grant. Make sure that you have those details ready to go to be put in. A grant application I recently wrote, the one that I'm still waiting to hear back from, hopefully at the end of this month, within the 25-page limit, I was able to include some details about how we had completed a similar project in the last 2 years about another training topic and how we were able to market that information out. And the marketing was a big key to this new grant application. They wanted to know when their funds were spent for training that we were really going to be reaching a wide group of people. So I was able to include information actually about our UAS, our drone training program, and how successful we feel we've been able to market that not only within Ohio but nationally, to show that we can do that for other programs. So think about that. Think about what has your agency done in the past. Talk to people who maybe been there even before you came on board, if you're more recent, and get information that you can include in the grant application. This picture, kind of the information we have here on this screen, is something I say very frequently. Square peg, square hole, round peg, round hole. You don't want to try to make something fit where it doesn't. So look for grants which address your needs. You want to make certain that you're not trying to write a grant application for something that they aren't looking to fund. So I'm going to move our next mentee question on and tell me, and this part here, I was curious too, what are some of your current go-to sources for grant applications or grant funding that you might be willing to share? I know folks aren't always willing to share places that they found that they look for funding. I'll tell you one that I tap into is the Community Foundation in the Zona, and the ODOT library. Zona is a wealth of information. Absolutely. Our county where I live here in Ohio has a community foundation, and they have been fantastic in providing funds to our community. And as a community foundation, they actually have a lot of different funds and different types of grants that can be made. So ODOT, yes, ODOT's a huge source. Another thing you can do, especially if you've never written a grant application before and you're looking for grant sources, is you can go out and do a Google search for, say, 990, which is the tax return completed by nonprofits. And, if you have an idea for specific organizations you'd like to see what they fund, you can Google their name and the 990, because all of the private not-for-profits that do grant funding are required to file that tax return generally, and it is publicly available. So the Foundation Center, yes. Grants.gov, absolutely. So, talk to other people too, who you know of who've done grant writing, and they can definitely tell you different sources that are out there. So I'll go ahead and leave that question up, but I'm going to navigate us back over to the presentation. So with your writing, you want to make sure who is the grant funding, and what need does the grant want to address. Don't just apply to get experience applying for a grant, because what will happen is if they see you apply, but it doesn't really match what it is that they're, asking for, it's almost like crying wolf. And I'm sure that, a lot of you have been told that story about Peter and the wolf and how he cried wolf twice. And then when the wolf really showed up, nobody came to save him. Save your, capital, your opportunity all your hard work for when you really have a grant that meets the needs that you need to have funding for. And then, as a part of that too, if you're going to if you found that grant, but there's measurements that need to be done that you just feel that are not going to be able to be completed by the organization or agency you're working with, even though the grant funding might meet your needs, don't apply for it if you're not sure that the reporting can occur, because the reporting is also key. It's a whole package deal. If they don't get their reporting, then the grantor, very well could discount you as a grant writer or that organization in the future and not even consider any applications you send in. Worst case, they could come back after you for the grant funds if you don't follow up with the reporting. You need to make certain that, you're following up with those details and that they can be provided. It makes me think of a organization that I was working with that was a ball organization, softball, baseball, youth league. And I tell you what, the 3 months of that season, those parents were Johnny on the spot and would do anything for you. But I'd be hard pressed to get them to answer the phone the other 9 months of the season. So if there was reporting requirements or measures of success that needed to be reported those other 9 months of the year, it probably wasn't going to happen. So I would never have committed that organization to a grant where they had to do reporting out during the times when the parents weren't actively involved with the ball season. So grant requirements review. This is a big piece of the puzzle. So you've gotten all your information together, you're waiting, all of a sudden you find out about a grant opportunity. The first thing I do is look at the time frame. If it's due tomorrow, I'm not going to write for it because there just isn't enough time to put together all the information normally that you would need. Writing something at the very last minute in a rushed fashion is never a good idea. It works best when you get on a mailing list or you get on a notification list to let you know that a grant opportunity has come about, and that you can be notified enough time that you can then map out from that due date backwards what your deadlines are going to be to get information put together. The other thing is make very careful that you follow those submission requirements. Like the grant I wrote most recently, 25 pages was the limit. And I actually ended up coming in under that for the narrative that we submitted. But I never would have gone over it because that's the first thing they'll do. And a lot of times they just disqualify you on the fact that you couldn't follow directions. So make sure you follow the submission requirements. And again, the reporting requirements, you want to make sure that you've got that figured out ahead of time. You don't want to have any issues with getting your reporting in. I actually will build it into the grant schedule to show that if we complete this, then these are additional steps that are part of the grant process that we need to make sure are completed. And then compliance with the requirements of the grant. A lot of times it isn't just a report that has to be sent in. I show this sign here because 2 of the grants that I've assisted with were actually grants that were awarded to our local township and a nonprofit that were working in partnership together to get that park established. But the land that was a part of the funding for the first grant is now forever committed to be a park. And, it can't be changed. By law. So, not only that, but we have to have this sign up down there to show that the funding came from that fund. So you want to make sure that if there are additional requirements, it's not just the paperwork, that if there are other pieces and parts, because we actually had a township trustee who got elected after the group that I worked with to get the park put in place, who he decided he didn't want to be responsible as a township trustee for that park anymore. And there were numerous meetings he kept voicing the fact of, well, let's just put a chain and a lock on the gate and not let anybody in anymore. And they told him repeatedly, the other two trustees that were still there from the initial group, we can't do that. We have this grant and we have to forever keep that open as a park. So just make sure that you understand what the requirements are of the funding that you're getting. You know, one thing that I like to do is, especially if we don't have this in the grant packet, is I'll call up the grant manager and ask, you know, are we permitted or could we possibly see your scoring matrix? Because that's how, you know, a lot of times the information you write needs to be tailored is to maximize the number of points you're going to get. With those ODNR grants that I just mentioned, when I went back with the township, you know, 10 years later to ask for funding for park equipment to put up a playground there. You know, one of the things that was in the scoring matrix was whether we had ever received funding before. And if we hadn't, there was points that were awarded there. It was important to know that. It was important to know how they were going to score what it is that we were submitting. So make sure that you're going through all those requirements. And then you need to plan your application strategy. If you have a team that you can work with, that's great. But if you don't, you still need to put a strategy in place and write out your game plan, because there's going to be, you know, information you're going to have to get from subject matter experts to include in the grant application. When I was working with the fire department on different grants, one of them was for funds to get a unit that had more leads on it for people who are having a heart attack, where they could hook that person up and transmit ahead so they could skip the ER and take them straight in for, you know, treatment if they needed to, if the person was having a severe enough heart attack. Otherwise, the person, when they got there to the hospital, would have to just be taken to the ER to be assessed. And, you know, that was a, you know, important information I had to get from those subject matter experts, because I am not a medical person. I don't pretend to be, but they had all the key information I needed there to not only explain what that unit was and the benefits, but to make sure that I could emphasize in the application that they were a rural fire department that was located more than 20 minutes away from the hospital, and they were staffed by volunteers who many times could take, you know, some time to get to the station before they could get dispatched out to the person who was having the heart attack. So when you start adding all that time together on top of the fact of, you know, what that unit could do for you, all of that really played into, I believe, showing the need we had for the funding in order to be able to purchase that unit. So it's important to work with your subject matter experts. It's also very important, as you're working through your grant application process, that your financial plan be checked and double checked and triple checked by not only yourself, but find somebody else to look those numbers over for you and make sure that they feel that they add up. Because I've seen a number of times where things get submitted and the application looks fantastic, but the numbers don't match. And then it makes them question the entire application and whether or not it's someone that they can trust with their money. So make sure you get your actual figures whenever you can. You know, collect up any details you need, maps, reports, traffic counts. I mean, all of that needs to be lined up. Your letters of support for any type of in-kind or additional funding, you know, make sure you have those well ahead of time. The one grant that I wrote recently, I had to get letters of support from about 4 different organizations here in Ohio. And that was actually, as I went through that grant application and started writing out my to-dos, that was one of my top priorities. It might seem like a simple thing, but I had to coordinate with 4 different agencies, and they had to internally get the, you know, go ahead to give me those letters of support. So I knew it was going to take time. So, you know, and then review the questions and your responses. You know, if you have multiple people working on the application, you know, make sure you make assignments, but also you can do check-in meetings. It's nice to have a team when you can have a team, you know, but make sure you're holding each other accountable. Sometimes too, it just depends on the process for the grant application, how much time they're giving you as far as, who you can involve. But if you do have a team, one of the things that I want you to pay real close attention to is making sure that if different people write different sections of the application, that you have one person that goes back and puts a consistent voice to it. Because if you call something one name in one section and then call it something different in another section, you're going to confuse the folks who are judging those applications or scoring them. Just watch your time schedule and make sure, if at all possible, that you deliver your grant application ahead of time, well before the actual due date. I always plan to have mine in ahead of time because you just never know what's going to happen in those last few days, and it buys me a little bit of a buffer if something does occur. I've had people for applications that we were accepting through the Township Sign Grant Program. There's always seems to be somebody who emails the day after it was due with some reason why they couldn't get it in and completed. So, try to make certain that you're not that person emailing, because normally the cutoff day is the cutoff day and you'll just have to wait till the next cycle. If you can have a grant coordinator, that's fantastic, because that person can have all of the basic information ready to go, and then they are able to work with the different subject matter experts in your agency to pull the additional information that they need. It's wonderful if you can have someone who is doing that grant writing for you and is able to get those submissions, and it also helps you keep that one person at the forefront for relationship building. Here's my little cartoon about staying ahead of the curve. It says we were ahead of the curve and then the curve ran right over us. And that's going to happen sometimes. You're going to be ahead of the curve with these applications and something will happen and then you'll not get it in on time. And don't beat yourself up too badly if that does happen. Hopefully there'll be another time that you can submit. So, it's important, though, to try to stay ahead of the curve as much as possible. What you would want to request in your grant application, and this is a really important thing, is you do not want, if at all possible, to request 100% funding, because you're going to rarely find anybody willing to give you all the money you need to complete a project. What you want to try to do is, leverage different funding sources. So, look to see what other funding sources the grant will accept. Will they accept in kind? I mean, that was one of the things that with the ballpark, and specifically the putting that playground up, they accepted in kind. So the time that the township spent digging the footer for the playground, all of the expense that went into paying their employee, that could all be counted towards the contribution of the township to the grant. So that was a great thing. Also, they were able to have a Eagle Scout candidate who actually was the one that put that playground in. And the Eagle Scout candidate went out and did fundraising, and that fundraising was put in as a source towards that playground equipment. And then all the time that the Eagle Scout and the Scout volunteers spent putting that up also counted in too. So, there's a lot of ways that you can look at having additional funds in the mix that are outside of just money straight out of your agency or organization's operating budget. And if you can find a way to leverage additional sources, that's fantastic. If you can have more than one grant that will be leveraged together, that's a wonderful thing. One thing you got to watch out for is that grants typically don't cover ordinary operating expenses unless it's a funding program to get something started. That's about the only time that I've seen them actually cover operating expenses. So you just need to make sure that you know what you can contribute to the project. And you put that in there as part of the pro forma. With the initial building of the park, there was a probably a 2-year conversation that went on in the community before we even got to the point of putting the application in. So we were able to get letters of support and financial commitments to help show that there was, commitment from the community to make that happen. And then leveraging other funding sources, like I mentioned, is really critical. I know with a lot of the projects that where we see asks for funding from ODOT and the local LET side of the house, that they also leverage Ohio Public Works Commission funds as well, OPWC. So, make sure you get your plan together. And if you aren't comfortable, as to how this can all work together, we do have a once every other year event through LTAP called Show Me the Money. And one of the things we try to focus on during that event, when we not only bring in the people who award funds from different programs to speak about what their program funds, but we ask folks who have been able to do leveraging of multiple funding sources to come and talk about how they did it. So that's a good thing to know. We'll be doing that again later this year, more than likely virtually, but we do have the recording from 2 years ago, 2019, that's available on the LTAP site. So we're getting down to the wire here, getting towards the end of the outline I had for you. And this part here, it seems bright and cheerful and colorful, but it's the part that probably will trip you up more than anything, especially as you're getting started. You have to answer the questions that the grant maker is asking. I know when I wanted to start in grant funding, that was the absolute hardest part for me because, the grant funder is like Joe Friday here on your screen. They just want the facts. They just want to know how it is that, your project is going to fit what they've asked. And I wanted to rewrite their question for them and give them an answer that, they really hadn't asked for. So, once you take a stab at it, especially the first time, sit down with somebody who wouldn't be afraid to hurt your feelings and tell you if you did that. Have them say, no, I want you to know this question that they've asked, do you feel that my response answers that? So the other thing I want you to do is to make sure that you are writing your responses in plain language. Plain, don't make it a big, long, voluminous, response when it could have been a very short and concise response. So, there's a lot of tools out there that you can use to help you with this. One thing that I used was a book, and I'm not, recommending it or anything like that, but I'll tell you that there is one out there called Plain English for Lawyers, and it helps. If you look at the book over, and hopefully you can get it from the library or free on, blending device. What it does is it teaches you how to rephrase what you're saying to use as concise language as possible. There's also, through our LTAP e-learning, a course in the environmental category that is focused on plain language and how to write very concise and clearly. So here's our last mentee question. You guys thought you were going to get out of having to do any more mentees, but there's one more here for you. I'm going to put it up on the screen real quickly. And last mentee question, can you tell me some acronyms your employer agency uses? So, and you can tell me more than one in here, but give me some acronyms, because I know I could give you the ODOT acronym soup. I mean, there are so many acronyms in our agency. Oh, there we go. FHWA, WVDOH, FMSC, FMCSA, sorry, BMP, TAP, SRTS. I know some of them. I know TAP is the Transportation Alternatives Program. SRTS is Safe Routes to School. CEAO, the County Engineers Association of Ohio. Thank you to whoever put LTAP up there, Local Technical Assistance Program. I mean, there are just so many acronyms out there. Sometimes I think it's fun to throw an acronym out at my kids and let them tell me what they think it means. CMAQ, yep. I mean, that's one thing, is that there are so many acronyms. You've got to be careful with your writing that you are not using terms that they are going to think means something else. So caution, I found another acronym for you, AOS, acronym overload syndrome. Just make sure that you're not using, too many acronyms, or if you use an acronym, spell it out first and then put the acronym behind it. And then after you've done that, then you can feel free to use it in the document, but don't give them an acronym without telling them what it is first. Don't assume that they know what it is, because a lot of times the granting organization will ask, other people, especially like our community foundation, they have community volunteers who, rotate on and off the board, and who will read grant applications, and they may not know what HSIP means, or what STIC means. They'll assume that it to be something else, and then it won't make any sense. So just make sure you're not overloading them with acronyms, and make sure that you are answering the questions that are asked, and answer all of them. Sometimes it's hard to answer a question if you don't feel like you can give the absolute best response to it. But if you can't, then, if you need to find a way to explain something, explain it. Don't just skip the question, or give an answer that doesn't fit, the question that was asked. If you maybe unfortunately had an issue in the past with funding you received from this granting organization, and, you need to broach that. Don't try to cover it up. They'll appreciate the honesty and the candor, and hopefully feel, okay, well, they might have had an issue in the past, but now we know, that they know what the concern was, and that they're saying here that it won't happen again. So we'll put some more funds in, and they're going to do the right thing. So just make sure you're answering the questions that are asked. And as I mentioned before, consistency is key. You need to have one person who's the final author of the grant application, meaning that they go through and make sure that all the terms are used consistently. Any acronyms are all spelled out, that there's one voice really behind your application. So the last part, and it's probably, just as critical of a part as knowing what your need is relationship building. You want to build relationships with the grant making agencies so they know who your organization or what your organization is. If you are invited to present on your application, don't ever pass up the opportunity to present, because that gets you in the room with the people who are making the decision to be able to make that personal connection. I am astounded when I hear of entities or organizations who make grant applications are invited to present to the group that's going to make the decision and pass up the opportunity. You need to make that happen. So don't ever pass up the opportunity to present on your grant application. And don't be afraid to follow up on your application, but don't be a pest either. This picture of this little girl with that look on her face, when I'm calling to follow up on a grant application, I always think to myself, please don't let me put this look on that person's face when they hear me on the other end of the phone or hear my voicemail message, because all I want to do is just find out where things are in the process. There's a grant that our local school district actually puts out for the community through a partnership that they made with the local energy company, and they do not have a consistent schedule as to when they put this application out. They don't have a consistent schedule as to when they're going to fund things. I've even seen them skip some years and decide not to fund anything and just move on. So I have learned through time that if I put an application in, I really need to call and follow up. So it's important to keep that communication open, but don't become a pest. And you don't want to become a pest, because if they feel that you're going to be a problem, they might decide not to fund you just so they don't have to deal with you once you have their money. So, there's a balance, and you'll figure it out. Another thing I look at with organizations, and this is another good thing to look at when I told you to Google for the 990 tax returns from different organizations, is to look at what they funded in the past. Modus operandi is a Latin term for looking at how somebody has operated in the past for an indicator of how they're going to operate in the future. So, look in the past and see how much have they awarded and for what type of projects. Because you don't want to be, if they're offering $250,000 in funding, but you pull up the 990 tax return and on there they do list, who they've given money to and how much. You don't want to be the one person who asked for the whole 250,000. Normally they only give it out 20,000 at a time, because if you ask for the whole pot of money and the granting agency normally only gives it out in small batches, they're just going to take your application right off the table and you won't even be in the mix when they get down to the scoring. So just make sure that you look to see that the amount you're asking for and what you're asking to be funded, if at all possible, fits what they've done in the past. And with ODOT projects that are awarded on the local LET side, they keep a history of what's been awarded to who and how much and what it's paying for. So, don't be afraid to call up the funding manager and ask them for that list. Yes, somebody has asked to please provide a link to our Show Me the Money, and I will be happy to do that. I'll make sure that that gets included in the follow-up email. Another thing to do, and this can sometimes be hard when you get a letter saying, thanks, but we're not going to fund you right now. Sometimes you just want to tuck that away and forget that you even put all the effort into the application. But it's important for your own professional growth and hopefully to, be successful in future applications. Even with that, grant maker, is call them up and ask for some feedback. What was it that was the deciding factor on, our grant as to why we didn't get funded? Was there one specific thing, or there are a number of things that just didn't quite fit what you were looking for? And then a lot of folks who provide grants, do network with people who provide grants and other agencies. Ask them about their knowledge of other grants on the topic. They may point you in a direction that it'll be the best grant you've ever gotten, but you never would have found out if you hadn't called up and talked to that person. So pick up the phone, call them. Don't send them an email. Give them a call and talk to them. So I do want to go ahead and open things up for some additional questions. Since we've got 100 folks on here, I'm not going to unmute the phone line. There was a question, and it says that the government uses CRA or CIP funds on a project. Can grants still be applied for, or would that be double dipping? I apologize that I cannot remember off the top of my head what CRA or CIP stands for. So Jenny, if you can drop that in the chat. And if I can't answer it for you right now, I'll get you an answer and get it out to everyone. I do know that there are a number of different funding sources that can be applied from different areas to the same project. Okay, Community Reinvestment Act or capital improvement projects. I'm going to have to get you an answer on that one. That's not something that I've dealt with in the past before personally or professionally, but I will definitely get you an answer on that one and get it out to everybody. But as I mentioned before, I know that you can leverage funding, such as the Ohio Public Works Commission, along with different projects that, funding sources ODOT has. I know where funds from the safety program have been leveraged with funds maybe from the Transportation Alternatives Program or other funding sources that ODOT offers, and can all be bundled together to get a project completed. So thank you everybody for your time this morning, for spending an hour with me. I hope you enjoyed the Mentimeter part. I was trying to make it a little more interactive. And if you do have any questions at all, or just want to chat about your own situation and where you're trying to get started with grant funding, or maybe you're at a stumbling block, I'm always here and available. Yes, I'll put my email in the chat, and I'll also make sure you have it on the follow-up email that goes out to everybody. I'm going to go ahead and send this out now. It's Victoria Beale. It's victoria.beale, B as in boy, EALE, at dot.ohio.gov. So please feel free to reach out. I'm here as a resource for you, and I wish you the very best with all of your future grant writing. Take care.